I understand that. I understand that. I mean, the thing of it is that us as comedians, we all, every last person that Kat talked about, everybody that I talk about, we all worked hard as to get here.
Mike Epps is a man who has made millions of people laugh, yet very few have ever asked what truly causes a comedian pain. Behind the laughter on stage is someone who has lived through poverty, brutal competition, and moments of self-doubt, wondering whether he was slowly being pushed to the margins. Throughout more than 3 decades of his career, Mike Epps has never openly declared war on many people. But every name that once made him uncomfortable, wounded, or provoked a strong reaction was never a coincidence. Those moments came when he felt his position was being threatened. His worth was being diminished, and his ego was struck in the deepest ways. This is not a story of loud public feuds, but the journey of an artist confronting his greatest fear. So, who and what has truly made Mike Epps unable to remain as calm as his outward appearance suggests? A childhood that shaped a name. Indianapolis was not a place where Hollywood dreams were born. It was a quiet Midwestern city, where working-class neighborhoods stretched on with a harsh rhythm of life and very little room for romance. In 1970, Mike Epps was born there. No spotlight, no red carpet, no promise of an easy future. His family belonged to the typical working class of post-war America, working hard, speaking little, and constantly counting every dollar just to survive. In Indianapolis, dreaming big was not forbidden. There was simply no time for dreams. Mike Epps's childhood unfolded in a society heavy with pressure. School violence, silent competition among youth groups, and a constant sense that a single moment of carelessness could turn you into the weak one. In that environment, Epps learned a lesson absent from any textbook. To stay safe, you had to make others notice you on your own terms. And for young Mike, the fastest way was to make people laugh. At first, it was not laughter meant for entertainment. It was laughter meant to avoid trouble. A well-timed joke could diffuse tension. A moment of humor could make someone hesitate before striking. Mike Epps recognized this connection very early. Being funny brought attention, and being noticed meant you were less likely to be bullied. As a teenager, while many other kids were still searching for their identity, Epps already understood that laughter could become a kind of armor. Over time, that reflex became deeply ingrained in who he was. Mike did not tell jokes to be liked, but because it was how he controlled the space around him. At school, in the neighborhood, at small gatherings, Epps was always the one talking the most, not out of confidence, but because silence equaled danger. Laughter became a survival mechanism sharpened through real situations and repeated confrontations with looks of contempt. It was during those years that a very particular ego began to take shape. Mike Epps became extremely sensitive to being underestimated. He hated the feeling of being looked down on, hated being passed over right in front of his eyes. Not out of arrogance, but because deep down it triggered an old fear. The fear of being pushed to the bottom, overshadowed, turned invisible. Many people later saw a Mike Epps who was hot-tempered, reactive, and uncomfortable with the rise of others. Few remembered that the roots of those reactions were planted when he was still a boy in Indianapolis. The numbers that came later, dozens of films, hundreds of stand-up shows, millions of dollars in income, did not erase those psychological marks. If anything, they sometimes made them clearer. When you grow up in an environment where every position must be fought for, the feeling of being replaced is not just a professional setback. It is a direct blow to the ego. Mike Epps's childhood explains many things: why he cannot tolerate being overshadowed, why the rise of others can wound him so deeply, and why the feuds in his life often began not with money, but with a sense of threat. In Indianapolis in 1970, Mike Epps learned to laugh in order to survive. And decades later, standing on the biggest stages in America, that part of him has never truly left. Where Mike Epps forged himself. In the early 1990s, when Mike Epps had just passed the age of 20, Indianapolis was no longer a place where he could stand still. The city had taught him how to laugh in order to survive, but it offered no path to go further. Around 1992-1993, Epps made what he later admitted was the most reckless decision of my life, leaving his hometown carrying only a few sets of clothes, a vague dream, and the only weapon he had his ability to make people laugh. His first destination was Atlanta, which at the time was emerging as a new center of black culture in the United States. But Atlanta did not welcome Mike Epps as a talent. It tested him the same way it tested every other unknown. The comedy clubs there, from small hot smoke-filled stages, operated like a cold elimination system. There was no such thing as a trial run. Every night on stage was a public judgment. If the audience didn't laugh, you were booed. If you lacked nerve, you were swallowed whole. During this period, Epps performed almost every night. He later recalled nights when he was paid only a few $dozen, and others when he wasn't paid at all, except for the chance to be allowed back the next time. But it was here that Mike Epps' style began to take shape. He did not perform to please middle-class audiences. He performed in the language of the streets, raw, real direct, and highly defensive. The stories he told were not polished because his life had never been polished either. Around 1994, Mike Epps pushed further to Brooklyn, New York. If Atlanta was the testing ground, Brooklyn was the molding press. New York allowed no hesitation. Open mic stages there could lift you up in a single night, but they could also crush you instantly. Epps understood that if he wanted to survive, he could not become a softer version of himself. He chose instead to sharpen his edge harder, sharper, more dangerous. That relentless collision course led him to the most important turning point of his life. In 1995, Mike Epps was invited to appear on Def Comedy Jam, the iconic comedy show founded by Russell Simmons, that had introduced names like Chris Tucker, Bernie Mac, and Martin Lawrence. Def Comedy Jam was not just a television show. For the black comedy community, it was the official gate of recognition. Standing on that stage meant you had surpassed hundreds, even thousands of other unknown competitors. When Epps appeared on Def Comedy Jam, he was not a rookie. He was the product of more than 3 years worn down by comedy clubs, by booze, by failed nights on stage. That was what gave his performance a different energy. No pandering to the audience, no asking for permission, no apologies. And the audience recognized it. From that moment on, Mike Epps began to be mentioned in black comedy circles as someone not easy to deal with, but undeniably real. Later statistics showed that within just 2 to 3 years after Def Comedy Jam, Epps had moved from small stages to larger tours, paving the way for his transition into film in the late 1990s. But more important than the numbers was the internal shift. Stand-up comedy taught him a rule he carried throughout his career. No success comes from pure luck. Everything is paid for with endurance, constant collision, and the acceptance that every time you step on stage, you are placing yourself in danger. Mike Epps did not emerge from stand-up comedy as a pampered star. He emerged as a survivor. And that posture, always alert, always ready to react, followed him into Hollywood, where the lights were brighter, the money greater, but the battles far more subtle and brutal. The years of struggle on stand-up stages carried Mike Epps into Hollywood, but they also brought with them an obsession that never left him. No position is ever safe. In a world where a name can be replaced after just one season, Epps understood all too well how terrifying it feels to be overshadowed. And then, just as he believed he had finally found solid ground, another name began appearing more frequently, younger, faster, and embraced by the market in a way Epps had never experienced. Kevin Hart did not arrive as an enemy, but as a brutal reminder that the spotlight can change hands at any moment. And it was precisely that fear that turned competition into resentment. Kevin Hart, a feud, born from the fear of being left behind. There was a point in his career when Mike Epps believed he had entered a safe zone. In the early 2000s, after Next Friday 2000 and Friday After Next 2002, his name was closely tied to box office success, steady stand-up tours, and stable income. In his early 30s, Epps had what many comedians dreamed of: a firm position, a loyal audience, and recognition within the black comedy community. It was precisely at that seemingly solid moment that Kevin Hart began appearing more frequently, faster, cleaner, and embraced by the mainstream market in a way Epps had never experienced. From small stages to cable television and then feature films, Hart built a meteoric trajectory between roughly 2008 and 2013. He released consecutive hit specials, exploded at the box office with Think Like a Man, 2012 and Ride Along 2014, and expanded his influence far beyond his core audience. The difference was not talent, both had plenty, but rhythm and image. Kevin Hart was clean, mainstream, fast. Mike Epps was gritty, lived in, marked by scars. As the market increasingly favored safe products, the feeling of being pushed aside could arrive quickly. During that period, Epps made public remarks that revealed discomfort, sarcasm, even criticism. Not specific accusations, but short, sharp lines enough for listeners to sense the tension. Years later, in a candid conversation, Epps admitted, "I took that sigh to heart." That brief sentence revealed something essential. The pain was not caused by any single act, but by the feeling of being left behind as the spotlight shifted. Mike Epps' reaction, therefore, should not be read as hatred toward Kevin Hart as a person. It resembled a defensive reflex of the ego. When you have spent years climbing, endured enough collisions to secure a place, watching someone else cross that path faster can trigger the deepest fear. Were your sacrifices being erased? Epps did not deny Hart's talent. He reacted to the mirror. Hart unintentionally held up a mirror reflecting questions of value timing and who gets to remain at center stage when tastes change. Here the wound was not loud, but persistent. It did not need open conflict to exist. Seen more broadly, the Epps-Hart story is not merely a personal clash. It reflects a familiar cultural and social tension within creative industries. When markets reward speed and reach, artists who build careers on depth and lived experience often feel pushed into a corner. Competition becomes most dangerous when it turns inward, when the quiet fear of replacement erodes the ability to see another's success as a parallel reality rather than a threat. In that context, Sharpe remarks are not the cause, but the symptom. What is most striking in this relationship is not what was said, but how Mike Epps gradually looked back at himself. Acknowledging the emotion even late signaled a step toward maturity, naming the fear, so it no longer controlled his behavior. Yet the question remains, when an artist learns to face the feeling of being left behind, does reconciliation truly close old wounds, or merely open a quiet interlude before subtler collisions ahead? Because after Kevin Hart, Mike Epps would face another kind of hurt, one that did not come from the bright spotlight of someone more successful, but from public ridicule, where dignity was directly challenged and reactions were no longer confined to words. And that was when the story shifted into another chapter, harsher still. Lavar Walker, public provocation. If the tension with Kevin Hart was a quiet cut, the story with Lavar Walker unfolded in a far rougher and more public way. At that time, Mike Epps was already a major name with decades on stage, millions of dollars in box office revenue, and touring income. But fame does not grant immunity from insult. Around the mid-2010s, Lavar Walker, a lesser-known comedian who mainly worked local clubs, posted a mocking video targeting Mike Epps, alluding to old beefs and directly poking at his personal image. The video spread quickly, escaping the confines of an inside joke and becoming a public provocation in a space Mike Epps could not control. Here the context was entirely different from the Kevin Hart story. Walker was not a symbol of success against whom Epps measured himself. He appeared as an outsider using ridicule to attract attention. Yet that very difference inflicted a different kind of wound, not being surpassed, but being diminished. For an artist who had spent his youth building credibility on stage, being publicly mocked, especially by someone of a different standing, could feel like a violation of honor. And this time, Mike Epps' response did not stop at words. According to reports at the time, Epps reacted with actual physical violence, resulting in Walker being injured and hospitalized. Without delving into legal specifics, what matters is the shift from an artist wielding language to a person responding with his body. Public reaction was immediate and shocked. The image of a comedian who had brought laughter to millions was suddenly cast in the shadow of violence. The numbers once worn as badges of pride over 20 years in the industry, dozens of films, were not enough to stem the wave of criticism. The media questioned, audiences were disappointed, and Mike Epps faced a hard truth. When a reaction goes beyond words, the price is always higher than the moment of impulse. But if we view the incident merely as a personal mistake, we miss the deeper psychological layer. Epps' reaction was not simply a burst of anger. It resembled a defensive reflex triggered when the ego is directly struck. From Indianapolis to comedy clubs to Hollywood, Mike Epps had learned to protect himself with laughter. When that tool no longer worked, when mockery took place off stage and spread uncontrollably, he faced a loss of control. In that moment, Epps was no longer an artist performing. He became a person reacting to a perceived threat, even if that threat was symbolic rather than physical. On a broader level, this story reflects a familiar cultural and social issue. In the age of social media, the boundary between joking and insult has grown increasingly blurred. A few minutes of video can dismantle an image built over many years. For artists who came of age before social media, adapting to a space where dignity is publicly tested can be a shock. When old defense mechanisms lose their effectiveness, the risk of misreaction rises. And in cases like Mike Epps's, that misstep plays out under the gaze of the entire public. I would argue that the most painful part of the Lavar Walker story is not the media fallout, but the moment Mike Epps lost his familiar role. When laughter could no longer be used to diffuse the situation, he was forced to confront a harder question. How should an artist's ego be protected in a world where mockery travels faster than any explanation? Before that question could be answered, Mike Epps moved into yet another collision this time. Not with a lesser-known individual, but with a new media environment where words, images, and ego clash in far more subtle ways. Shannon Sharpe. A clash of public egos. Entering the 2020s. Mike Epps' stage was no longer confined to comedy clubs or movie theaters. It expanded into a new space: social media and podcasts, where words are clipped, spread, and reinterpreted within hours. In that context, the clash with Shannon Sharpe did not erupt from an old feud, but from the way the public consumes language. Sharpe, a former NFL star and host of Club Shay Shay, represents a new media generation, sharp, direct, and always ready to push a story beyond its original boundaries. When Mike Epps' remarks were quoted distorted or framed as confrontational, tension formed quickly. Both men's actions were initially reflexive. Short clips, comment threads, and back-and-forth responses appeared in rapid succession, not as a structured debate, but as a chain of reactions. For Epps, this was a challenge unlike those he had faced before. There was no live audience to read, no time to adjust timing. Every sentence became a piece of evidence permanently existing on the internet. In the early stage, Mike Epps also engaged in verbal sparring, trading media shots, defending his dignity with what he knew best: sharp language. What stands out, however, is what followed. Unlike previous clashes where emotions often escalated, this time Epps stopped. When facing Shannon Sharpe, he chose dialogue instead of pushing the conflict further. The two met in person, exchanged perspectives, and acknowledged the misunderstandings created by mediated communication. That choice did not make the story more dramatic, but it clarified something essential. Mike Epps had recognized the limits of instinctive reactions in an environment where every word can become a weapon against its speaker. Here, Epps' response marked a psychological turning point, not because he backed down, but because he understood the cost of letting the public ego take the lead. After more than 3 decades in the spotlight, from his earliest nights in Indianapolis to dozens of films and tours, Mike Epps understood that each platform demands a different mode of presence. In the podcast era, where millions may listen to a single episode, escalating conflict is no longer a sign of strength, but a potential sign of losing control. The symbolic message of this episode extends beyond Mike Epps himself. It reflects a cultural shift in how public figures manage image and emotion. When social media turns every statement into an event, the ability to pause to choose dialogue over confrontation becomes a rare form of maturity. For Epps, it was a late but necessary maturation, learning to protect himself not through rapid reaction, but by reclaiming control over his own narrative. From a personal perspective, I believe the clash with Shannon Sharpe shows Mike Epps entering a different phase of his career, less impulsive, more deliberate. Not every conflict requires a public winner and loser. Sometimes lowering one's voice at the right moment is the hardest victory of all. Yet the question remains: in an environment where every sentence can be severed from its context, can this composure last? And after stepping away from public media confrontations, how will Mike Epps face the quieter, more persistent tensions, those within the comedy world itself, where ego, history, and recognition continue to collide day after day? Smoldering conflicts. Within the comedy and rap worlds. Not all of Mike Epps' conflicts exploded into newspaper headlines. Most of them smoldered quietly, like small cracks that stretched on for years. In the black entertainment world, where hip-hop and comedy constantly intersect, the line between respect and dismissal is far thinner than outsiders might imagine. Both emerged from the streets, both carry survival narratives, and both place heavy weight on a shared value: street credibility. something that cannot be bought with money or views. It is precisely at this intersection that Mike Epps' tensions with certain comedians and rappers began to take shape. That cultural backdrop explains why seemingly harmless words can carry long-lasting impact. Mike Epps has spoken often indirectly and cautiously about frictions with peers such as Cat Williams and Ricky Smiley. Not public arguments, but the feeling of being undervalued in shared spaces, backstage areas, tours, private conversations. With Cat Williams, an artist known for a strong persona and razor-sharp language differences in style, could easily harden into ego distance. With Ricky Smiley, the divergence lay in their routes to the audience, one leaning toward gritty lived-in comedy, the other closer to television and radio. No one was wrong, yet the sense of not being properly recognized was enough to leave aftershocks. At the edge of these relationships stood rappers' figures, who sometimes viewed comedy as an accessory to hip-hop culture, rather than an equal pillar. Mike Epps has mentioned experiences of being underestimated in crossover settings, where laughter was treated as lighter weight compared to music and image. This did not lead to direct confrontation, but it struck a sensitive nerve. If comedy also comes from the streets, why is it ranked lower in the shared value system? For an artist who had spent more than 3 decades building a career from Def Comedy Jam in 1995 to dozens of feature films, that dismissal was not merely a personal opinion, but a scratch on professional dignity. Mike Epps' response to these smoldering tensions was rarely explosive. He did not choose verbal sparring or push matters toward media climax. Instead, came selective silence, half-spoken remarks, and quiet avoidance of collaboration. But silence does not mean the absence of pain. Prolonged abrasions may not make noise, yet they accumulate, shaping how an artist enters a room, reads the atmosphere, and wonders whether he is being respected as he should be. In Mike Epps, this manifested as constant vigilance and a need to control the communicative space. Viewed more broadly, this story reflects a larger cultural and social issue within Black entertainment. Money and reach are not the final measures. Respect rooted in understanding history, acknowledging contributions, and not diminishing one another's roles is the foundation that allows different fields to coexist. When that foundation is missing, competition slips easily into dismissal, and dismissal into injury. Mike Epps, positioned as both participant and longtime witness, seems to understand this better than most. From a personal perspective, I see these smoldering conflicts as no less important than public clashes. They show that pain does not require noise to exist. Sometimes the absence of explanation is what makes it endure. And when these unnamed fractures accumulate, the question is no longer who is right or wrong, but how an artist preserves dignity within an ecosystem where recognition is always being negotiated. Perhaps it is through passing these non-explosive conflicts that Mike Epps gradually shapes a personal philosophy, quiet, not overly defensive, to move toward the final chapter of the story. A chapter no longer centered on specific feuds, but on looking back at the entire journey and asking, after all the collisions, what remains when the lights go out? A quiet collision with Chris Rock. In the world of American comedy, Chris Rock is a monument in a very different sense from Mike Epps. If Epps represents the gritty laughter of the streets, Chris Rock embodies sharp intellect, political edge, and early recognition by the cultural elite. These two paths long existed in parallel, rarely intersecting directly. Yet it was precisely this parallel existence that created a subtle form of collision, quiet, without open confrontation, but sharp enough to touch the ego of those at the top of the profession. The context of this relationship was not a single incident, but a silent comparison sustained over many years. Chris Rock rose in the early 1990s, becoming a defining face of political comedy, winning Emmys, hosting Saturday Night Live, and being regarded by Hollywood as a voice of the era. Mike Epps, by contrast, emerged from unforgiving comedy clubs beloved by mainstream audiences, yet rarely placed on equal footing in academic or political discussions. When the two names appeared in the same space on stage, on talk shows, or through viral clips, that difference became unmistakable. The harm in this case did not come from direct insults. It came from moments that seemed playful. An offhand remark, a teasing jab in front of the camera, a half smile when mentioning the other's name. Mike Epps had moments of poking Chris Rock in public, placing him in the role of the one being tested, as if attempting to crack the formal image Rock had built. To outsiders, this could look like harmless banter between comedians. But to an artist sensitive to respect and standing, such moments carried another meaning. They quietly questioned who controlled the narrative. Mike Epps' response to Chris Rock was not as explosive as with Lavar Walker, nor as directly comparative as with Kevin Hart. It was subtler, a form of psychological competition. Epps did not seem to deny Rock's talent or stature, but he also did not accept being placed in a lower position within the symbolic hierarchy of American comedy. The tension was therefore kept at a level that preserved professional appearances, yet remained visible to those paying close attention. There were no public apologies, no official reconciliation, only a prolonged silence, like an unspoken agreement not to push things further. At a deeper level, the Epps-Rock dynamic reflects a familiar cultural and social question: who has the right to represent the voice of the community? In black comedy, recognition does not come only from audiences, but also from being labeled intellectual, political, or artistic. Chris Rock acquired those labels early. Mike Epps did not seek them, but neither did he accept being diminished because of their absence. The conflict here was not between two individuals, but between two models of success. One validated by cultural elites, the other forged through lived experience. From a personal perspective, I believe the collision with Chris Rock is one of Mike Epps' most difficult conflicts to articulate, precisely because there is no clear winner or loser. It forced Epps to confront a sensitive question: is an artist's value measured by institutional recognition or by the loyalty of the audience? And when those measures do not align, the feeling of being pushed outside the center can emerge even when you are already a star. It is this kind of silent collision that sharpens the portrait of Mike Epps, an artist not only battling others, but also wrestling with the invisible order of the industry he loves. And as these wordless tensions accumulate, they prepare the ground for a final chapter 1 in which Mike Epps is compelled to look back on his entire journey, no longer through the lens of confrontation, but through larger questions of ego, legacy, and calm after the lights go out. Looking back at the entire journey, it would be an oversimplification to say that Mike Epps is someone who holds grudges. In reality, he does not hate many people. The list of names that have hurt him is not long, but each name is tied to a significant slice of his inner life. Kevin Hart represents the fear of being left behind when the market shifts. Lavar Walker struck at personal dignity through public mockery. Shannon Sharpe reflected a clash of egos in the new media era. And the smoldering tensions with comedians and rappers are aftershocks of a value system in which respect must constantly be earned. No feud exists in isolation. All are expressions of transitional moments in which Mike Epps was forced to confront himself under different circumstances. What these clashes share is not the opponent, but the feelings they awaken. There is fear, the fear of being replaced, of being underestimated, of past sacrifices being erased. There is pain, not always expressed through anger, but often through prolonged silence. And there is transformation. Each conflict compelled Epps to recalibrate how he viewed himself, his craft, and his place in an entertainment world that never stops changing. When placed side by side, these feuds did not break Mike Epps. They sharpened him in different ways. From this, a philosophy gradually emerges. Comedy, no matter how powerful, does not heal everything. Laughter may soothe the surface, but it does not automatically mend deeper wounds tied to ego and recognition. For Mike Epps, laughter was once a survival mechanism, a tool for controlling space, a form of self-defense against being overshadowed. But when those threats appeared in new forms, media, social networks, mass taste, laughter was no longer enough. In those moments, anger, defensiveness, and even missteps became inseparable parts of a process of growth. Viewed more broadly, Mike Epps' story is not just about one individual. It touches a shared experience among many artists in creative fields. When value is measured by reach, when speed is favored over depth, the fear of replacement becomes a constant obsession. In that context, the most dangerous enemy does not come from others, but from inner insecurity, the force that can drive someone to react beyond what they themselves believe is right. Mike Epps lived through that, stumbled because of it, and gradually learned to name it. When the stage lights dim and the laughter fades, what remains is not a list of people he once clashed with, but a clearer understanding of himself. Mike Epps does not hate anyone. Most of all, he hates the feeling of being replaced. And that, in the end, is the greatest fear of every artist.
Some opinions expressed in this video may be subjective and reflect the content creator's perspective at the time of production. They should not be interpreted as objective facts or official positions. Legends never truly die, as long as we remember them. If you want to help us keep these stories alive, please subscribe to Silent Legends. What is your fondest memory of this icon? Share it in the comments below. I'd love to read your stories. Click this video right here on your screen. It's a journey you don't want to miss. Until next time.